The most powerful emperor on earth is buying the world's greatest treasures: silk, pearls, war horses, using pieces of printed tree bark. Not gold, not silver, tree bark. And when a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo witnesses this and goes back to Europe to tell people about it, nobody believes him. For 200 years. But here is the thing Marco Polo didn't understand, and neither did Europe. This wasn't madness. This was the future of money. China had already invented paper currency, state-backed credit, and centralized banking, 8 centuries before the first European banknote was ever printed. And then, in one of history's strangest reversals, they abandoned all of it. This is the buried financial history that most of the world has never heard. 1. The burden of copper and the birth of flying money. Let's start with a problem. It's the 8th century, the Tang Dynasty, and China is the largest, richest economy on the planet. But its currency is a disaster. The standard unit of money is the copper coin, a small round disc with a square hole punched through the center, symbolizing the round heaven and the square earth. One coin weighs almost nothing, but the economy is so enormous that any serious transaction requires thousands of them. Picture this. You are a tea merchant in southern China, and you need to pay a supplier in the capital. You don't hand over a purse. You hire a convoy of wagons to haul literal tons of copper coins, strung together on ropes, across hundreds of miles of mountain roads. Your money weighs more than your merchandise, and every bandit between here and Chang'an can hear you coming from a mile away. The empire was drowning in its own currency. Copper mines couldn't produce fast enough. The government called it a copper famine, a cash shortage, not because the economy was poor, but because it was too rich for its own coins to handle. So around the year 804 CE, merchants in the capital invented one of the most consequential financial tools in human history. Here is how it worked. A merchant arriving in Chang'an would deposit his mountain of copper coins with the provincial liaison office of his home region. In exchange, he received a single piece of paper, a certificate recording the amount. He could then walk 1,000 miles back home, completely empty-handed, present that paper to the local office, and withdraw his full deposit minus a small fee. A man could carry the equivalent of 10 wagons of copper in his sleeve. They called it fei qian, flying money, because unlike metal, this wealth could vanish in a gust of wind. While medieval Europe was still physically hauling chests of silver across the continent, Chinese merchants had just invented the wire transfer. But flying money was still just a receipt. It wasn't money itself. The leap from receipt to actual currency, that happened because of iron. 2. The iron trap and the Sichuan solution. By the 10th century, China had entered the Song dynasty, and what historians call a medieval economic revolution was underway. But in the western province of Sichuan, the government had forced the local population onto a currency of iron coins. And iron is cheap, absurdly cheap. To buy a single pound of salt, you had to carry 1.5 pounds of iron coins. Daily commerce had become a physical ordeal. So in the year 1008, 16 wealthy merchant families in the city of Chengdu made a decision that would change the history of money forever. They started printing their own paper vouchers on sheets of mulberry bark. You walked into their shop, dumped your iron coins on the counter, and walked out with a slip of paper called a jiaozi. And very quickly, something remarkable happened. People stopped redeeming the paper for iron. They just started trading the jiaozi directly, passing the paper from hand to hand as if it were money. Because it was money. The paper had become the thing. The Song government watched this private experiment succeed, realized its immense power, and in 1024 CE, they nationalized it. The state banned private notes, established official printing bureaus, and issued the world's first government-backed paper currency, backed by a reserve of roughly 28% in silver and copper. If you wanted, you could exchange your paper for hard metal. but most people never did. Now pause and absorb the timeline. The first European banknote was printed in 1661 by the Bank of Stockholm in Sweden. China had a functioning, state-regulated paper currency system more than 600 years earlier. While Europe was deep in the feudal Dark Ages, China had already cracked the fundamental insight that took the West another half-millennium to figure out. Money does not have to be the valuable thing. It just has to represent the valuable thing. 3. The mulberry alchemy and the executioner's sword. There is an obvious problem with turning paper into money. Anyone with a brush and some ink can try to copy it. The Song dynasty and later the Mongol Yuan dynasty understood that if counterfeiting went unchecked, the entire system would collapse overnight. So they engineered a set of security features that, frankly, are stunningly modern. First, the material itself. They didn't use ordinary paper. They harvested the inner bark of the mulberry tree, the same tree whose leaves feed the silkworms that produce Chinese silk. This mulberry bast fiber was tough, insect-resistant, and had a dark, slate-like texture that was nearly impossible to replicate with common materials. The government controlled the supply of this bark the way a modern state controls the formula for polymer banknotes. Then came the printing. Artisans carved intricate scenes, houses, trees, human figures, onto woodblocks and later copper plates, reproducing details so fine that a manual forger simply could not match it. By 1270, Chinese money printers were laying down 6 separate colors of ink on a single bill. Europe would not achieve color printing for another several hundred years. On top of that, each note was stamped with a massive bronze government seal called the Bao Chao Yin, pressed into special vermilion ink. The stamp left a raised, tactile surface on the paper, an ancient version of intaglio printing, the same technique that gives a modern US $100 bill its distinctive texture. Treasury officials also embedded secret marks into each batch that only authorized bank tellers could identify. And if all of that technology still didn't stop you, printed directly on the face of every bill, right next to the artwork, was a message. Counterfeiters will be decapitated. Below it, an offer. Anyone who turned in a counterfeiter would receive a bounty of silver plus the criminal's entire confiscated estate. Sophisticated engineering on one side, raw terror on the other. A perfectly balanced system. But even the threat of beheading could not protect the currency from its most dangerous counterfeiter, the government itself. 4. The Great Khan's Casino and the first hyperinflation. In the 13th century, the Mongols conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, did not destroy the paper money system. He turned it into the most ambitious monetary experiment the world had ever seen. In 1271, he declared paper the sole legal tender of his empire. Gold and silver were banned from everyday transactions. If a foreign merchant arrived from India or Persia carrying sacks of pearls and silver, he was required to surrender them to the imperial mint. In return, the emperor handed him printed mulberry bark. This is what Marco Polo saw, and it stunned him to his core. To a Venetian raised on solid gold florins, the idea that an emperor could buy anything on earth with paper was indistinguishable from sorcery. Polo wrote that the great Khan had mastered the secret of alchemy in perfection. He could manufacture infinite wealth at zero cost, and for a while it worked. The currency was strictly pegged to silver reserves stored in government warehouses across the empire. Trade flowed, the economy hummed. Then came the wars. Kublai Khan launched catastrophically expensive invasions of Japan and Southeast Asia. Rebellions erupted across the provinces. The army needed to be paid, and the silver reserves started to run dry. So the government did what every government with a printing press eventually does. They printed more, and then more, and then more. They quietly drained the silver from the provincial warehouses to cover the capital's deficits, and once the metal backing was gone, they just kept the presses running. By the mid-1300s, the yuan currency had lost nearly all its value. Prices spiraled, merchants refused to accept the paper. The people's trust, the only thing that had ever made the paper worth anything, evaporated. The monetary collapse didn't just damage the Yuan dynasty, it helped destroy it. 5. The Great Regression: How China Unlearned Its Own Invention. What happened next is, to me, the most fascinating part of this entire story. When the Ming dynasty overthrew the Mongols in 1368, they tried to issue their own paper currency, the Da Ming Bao Chao. But they repeated the exact same mistake. No spending discipline, no reserve enforcement. By 1425, the Ming paper note was practically worthless. And here is where China made a choice that altered the trajectory of global economics. The trauma of 2 consecutive hyperinflation disasters was so severe that the Chinese state did something almost unthinkable. They abandoned paper money entirely. Not temporarily, permanently. 500 years of financial innovation, the most advanced monetary system on the planet, was deliberately dismantled and buried. China retreated to a hard money economy based on physical silver. But here is the cruel irony. China had very few silver mines of its own. So to run their economy, they had to import it. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Chinese economy had become a colossal vacuum, sucking in thousands of tons of silver mined by the Spanish Empire in the Americas. China traded away its most precious exports: silk, tea, porcelain, the products that had made it the envy of the world, just to acquire the raw metal it needed to function. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, Europe was doing the exact opposite. The Dutch were inventing joint stock companies. The English were building the Bank of England. The Italians had perfected double-entry bookkeeping. Europe was constructing the financial architecture of the modern world, using the very same principles that China had pioneered and then abandoned. The student had inherited the teacher's discarded tools and was using them to reshape the globe. 6. The Shaanxi Syndicate and the blood contracts. But the story of Chinese finance didn't end with the Great Regression. It went underground. In the early 19th century, during the Qing dynasty, moving bulk silver across China was still slow, dangerous, and expensive. There was no national banking system, and in 1823, in the remote landlocked province of Shaanxi, a dye merchant named Lei Lutai saw the gap. He revived the ancient principle of the bank draft. He founded the Risheng Chang, the Sunrise Provident, a private institution where you could deposit silver in Pingyao and withdraw it 1,000 miles away in Beijing. Within decades, the Shaanxi banks dominated the financial infrastructure of the entire Chinese empire. What made these banks extraordinary wasn't the concept, it was the enforcement. In 19th century China, the courts were corrupt and contract law was unreliable. So the Shaanxi bankers built their own system of trust from scratch. Bank managers invested no money, only their skill and reputation. In return, they earned enormous dividends, sometimes equivalent to 18,000 silver dollars a year, more than the highest paid government officials. But the price of that wealth was extreme. Managers signed contracts pledging their entire family's property. Some agreements explicitly allowed investors to seize a manager's wife and children if he committed fraud. Managers were posted to remote branches for years, forbidden from bringing family, forbidden from marrying locally, their letters home read by the head office. It was brutal. But over more than a century of operation, there is virtually no recorded case of a Shaanxi bank manager committing fraud. Not one. They financed the tea trade to Russia, bankrolled the Qing government through wars and rebellions, and kept the empire's commercial bloodstream flowing, all without a single law protecting them. So here is the question this history leaves us with. China didn't just dabble in paper money, they invented it. They perfected it. They stress-tested it across dynasties and centuries, and they discovered, before anyone else, both its extraordinary power and its fatal weakness. The power that an entire civilization can run on promises printed on tree bark as long as everyone believes. The weakness that the moment the people who control the press start printing for their own survival instead of the public's trust, the promise dies. And that brings us back to where we started, to Marco Polo standing in the court of Kublai Khan, watching the most sophisticated economy on earth run on mulberry bark, and thinking he was witnessing a miracle. He was right that it was extraordinary, but what he couldn't know, what nobody could know yet, was that he was also watching the beginning of the end. The empire that invented the future of money would soon choose to forget it ever existed. And the continent that called Marco Polo a liar would spend the next 500 years proving him right. If you found value in uncovering this buried chapter of financial history, make sure to subscribe to Silk Road Annals and hit that bell so you never miss our deep dives into the untold stories connecting the East and the West. I'll see you in the next one.